Hi everybody, Professor Snart here. Okay, so we keep moving through our English 1102 online course, and you're probably, if you kind of haven't felt it already, you're probably getting the sense of just how quickly we move from one unit to the next. So there's kind of like no downtime for our 8-week, time frame here. So we'll take a quick look at our due dates and then jump back into Unit 3. I think we took a quick look at that before in the earlier video announcement, but we'll go a little bit more in more detail through it here. Okay, so the bigger look at our due dates then. Again, that regular pattern. We've just finished up Unit 2 here, kind of setting the framework, providing us a vocabulary to talk about some of the things that will be provide us with the subject matter for our, what it, again, is fundamentally a writing course. So we're still most interested in those aspects of composition that we really do cover in Unit 3. So we finished that up Monday. It's Tuesday morning when I'm recording this. We're looking at our next due date of Thursday. And again, like I mentioned in an earlier announcement, I think Unit 3 is a really, really foundational one. It provides us with some of the most basic principles, again, related to the composition aspect of our course and getting in a little bit to the research part of it, or at least the use of quotation, citation, like weaving quotations into your own work that will then follow through and kind of develop step by step a few other things to put into place. And so just kind of longer term, it might be useful to note just how late into our 1102 course this first essay comes, which might be surprising to some people who are more used to doing an essay quite earlier, more essays, entirely. So we get actually almost halfway, if not further, through our course before we do an entire essay. And the theory behind this has a lot to do with the essay as an assessment device. It kind of tests your knowledge of the course. So it's at this point, right, and then of course towards the end, right, when we've built up our final essay, where we're putting all of the building blocks together that we've covered, starting really in Unit 2, especially in 3, kind of refining some more research skills as we get into Units 5 and 6. And so it's here that we finally put those all together in the full essay. From my perspective, using the essay as an assessment device, it doesn't really make sense to do one super early, because you almost inadvertently then use it as a test for things that we haven't necessarily covered or covered at great length. So it would be a little bit like giving the midterm in a history course, in week 3 when we haven't actually covered all of the historical time period that we're supposed to cover. You'd be testing things that you haven't really learned in the class. So what you need to then understand is that each of the units we go through, while they are kind of their own contained thing, they're like a stepping stone. They're part of that scaffolding that we work towards for when we put it all together in our first essay. And then again, you'll notice that we turn quite quickly around in our final units here, 9, 10, 11, are really just building a final essay. So the first half of our class is kind of learning the pieces. The second half is putting them into place in a shorter, it is shorter, but not by a lot, but just sort of a narrower in scope essay. You get some feedback so you know what's working, what's not working, and then we turn pretty quickly around and put those pieces back together, building off of what we've learned from that first essay and earlier units to produce that culminating essay that we finally get to. So if you're wondering why the essay doesn't come until so late in the course, that's kind of the theory behind it, right? We're learning the pieces, so you're doing each of these things, but also with that longer view to how they're going to fit together. Okay, so let's take a quick look at Unit 3 then. Again, like I've said a couple of times, one of our most important in terms of like the composition part of our course. And it is a little bit more involved, so we have these multiple folders that we walked through in our earlier announcement. Again, really important that you work through the material here. Don't just jump to the paragraph assignment. It won't make sense. That, it's like doing the test without having come to any of the classes. So the shape of an essay idea or the shape of a paragraph idea, I'll let you work through the video and sort of text and visual material here. It's basically a way of thinking about how we manage the relatively general and the relatively specific. And it's my contention that if you can get the gist of this theory and then actually put it into practice in an essay, which is really what we're doing in this particular unit, except instead of writing an essay, we're just writing a single paragraph. If you can get the gist of this, and regardless of the subject matter, it could be global warming, it could be literature, it could be automotive technology, whatever it is, if you can get the gist of this composition idea, you can write about just about any subject effectively. And so I would contend that you could create basically like a B paper with this theory. The only thing that would keep it from being an A is just basic sentence level typos or grammar mistakes, things that you can easily catch if you're just a good editor or if you have a peer editing system set up, or whatever. In other words, this idea gives you that basic foundation to write about just about anything effectively, probably at an A level if you're applying the theory correctly and if there's no kind of sentence level problems getting in the way. So that's sort of how important and how foundational it is, which is one of the reasons that it's provided in so many different forms. So all of the stuff we're seeing here is really the same idea, just elaborated in slightly different ways. And then, of course, we like to look at it in an example to see how it might actually work. One of the things with writing is that sometimes it's easy to look at the theory of it, but then, of course, putting it into practice can be a lot more challenging. And that's why we literally practice it. So in our case here, we don't jump into an essay. We'll practice this in a smaller paragraph format to see if we can do it, get some feedback or learn from our mistakes, and then, like with any skill, riding a bike, swimming, playing the violin, you get better the more you practice it. Okay, the other piece of the puzzle that we want to introduce here and then begin to start using correctly, MLA citation. So in addition to the composition aspect of our course, we are also 1102, sometimes called the research course. Not that you wouldn't have done that in 1101 or maybe in other classes, but it does play a major part in what we're doing here. So there's two strands that we're beginning to pull together. The research part, and that includes basic MLA text citation, so just doing the citation correctly, right? Where does it go? What goes in the parentheses? All the various examples that we have here. But also things like finding good sources, using them effectively within a paragraph, like where do they go, weaving them sort of seamlessly into a piece of writing so they don't stand out and create really choppy or chunky kinds of writing. So that's all stuff that we'll continue practicing after we've introduced it in this unit here. So I've had a few people ask if MLA citation matters for this paragraph. And it kind of does. I mean, we have the examples here, and we're only working with the one text that we're reading, Sherman Alexie's short story Flight Patterns. But this is also our first time doing it. So if you make a couple of almost like more like typo mistakes, that's not a big deal. But if I'm reading your paragraph and there's sort of like no relationship between the way you've done citation and the way it's presented here, which is kind of a black or white, right or wrong thing. It's one of the few things that we study that's really definitively, yes, this is right, no, this is wrong kind of a thing. If you're way off the map, it just kind of shows me that you haven't really worked through this material. And it's not super complicated, and it doesn't take a long time to look at. And again, it's really just a matter of following examples. There's very little kind of like high-level intellectual brain work to do. If your paragraph is like, bears no relationship to what we're looking at here, it just kind of shows me that you haven't done the content part of our class, and so your grade will reflect that. So for our purposes, we would probably follow this example here, right, where for the most part, citing from our short story, we'll just have a page number in parentheses. Notice that the period goes on the outside. So not super complicated, but if all of this stuff is wrong over and over again, it is indicative to me that you haven't really worked through our course material, or if you have, you're not applying it effectively, right? So there's no real mystery to it, let's put it that way. So we have a brief kind of introduction to MLA here, some examples that you can return to. I'm going to point you to our MLA citation link over here, which has a bunch of material, video walkthrough stuff, examples, everything you possibly need. For our paragraph purposes, we're not building a works cited page. We're just going to do in-text citation. If you have questions, you can always be in touch. And this is our first kind of introduction to it. So we're testing it out in our paragraph. It should be more or less correct, but it will take on more and more significance as we've done it more and more times throughout our course. Okay, so let's go back to the actual assignment. So I described the assignment at length here in the actual assignment folder. So I'm not going to walk us through it entirely. So we're reading this short story, we're building a paragraph as if this were occurring in a larger essay, so we don't need to do a whole bunch of introductory work as if it was like the introduction paragraph in an essay. We're just getting into our idea for this particular paragraph. So notice that we have pieces that we want to put into place. There's reminders about sort of style or tone that we're going for, and then the assignment itself is down here. So notice that the assignment is relatively brief and straightforward, but the various kinds of, I guess you could say, requirements or the idea that we're putting into place is pretty elaborate. I don't think it's complicated, but there's lots of description that you do want to read and attend to. So this I would call our first major or formal writing assignment, where things like grammar, mechanics, typos, that stuff, it does matter. Whereas in some of our earlier discussion boards, it was more about just fulfilling the assignment. It wasn't me grading on a sentence level all your work. You'll also notice that you won't get a ton of feedback on this. You can kind of guess at what mistakes you might have made based on the grading guidelines here, and did you fulfill the requirements? It's really no different in some ways than like a Scantron exam. We've done some course content, you're given an assessment. It's for the most part either right or wrong. There's really not as much gray area in writing, at least of this kind, that people think. And so you do the assessment, I grade it, and then we move forward. Again, we're not talking about a ton of points, so always keep the relative measure in mind. It's a few out of that whole 1,000. So it does matter, but always think of it in terms of points, and especially here, and this sort of takes us back to my first point about scaffolding through these units, None of them is hundreds of points at stake. That's really what we get to in the essays. Once you've had a chance to do these, right or wrong, and then learn from those mistakes, then we put it all into place, where you've had the chance to kind of practice things out, and then we play the actual game. All right, so Unit 3, super important. Be aware of those due dates. They come pretty regularly, pretty quickly. And by all means, if you have questions or concerns, be in touch with me.